Emmanuel, I want you to perhaps help us connect the dots between that first item we had, Rafael Grossi's warnings about Iran's nuclear program, and we know the nuclear talks are stuck. A lot of discussion now about what would the plan B be as Iran ramps up its nuclear program, and I guess, what's that book title? A series of unfortunate events taking place in Iran, perhaps a connection here.
Yeah, so I think it's very clear when you hear the director of the International Energy Agency, Atomic Agency, saying there's no other way. Well, the Iranians obviously think otherwise. There's another way for them. It is to deceive the International Energy Agency, Atomic Agency. It is to continue their enrichment of uranium, to deceive the international community. And if it wasn't for Israel's actions on the ground for many years, not only in the past few days, but for many years, Iran would be already much closer to the bomb. Iran today is already a threshold country. We have to realize that. And therefore, it's also one of the reasons why the so-called agreement, which we've been discussing for many months, that was supposed to be signed between the Biden administration and Iran, has never been signed and apparently never will be, because Iran already, there's no point anymore for such an agreement, since Iran is already a threshold country. And I think the fact that President Biden is scheduled to visit Israel and Saudi Arabia next month is not innocent.
Right. And of course, a lot of talk, I want to go back to this, a lot of discussion about what the plan B would be. That's presumably what not only the Israeli government, but some of the other governments in the region. Some may say the Saudi government would like to hear from the Americans. If not military action, maybe an upsurge in covert actions. Again, if we want to see it that way, maybe indicated by what we're witnessing with these deaths in Iran recently.
I think very clearly a plan B, whatever it is exactly, is being discussed between America and its allies in the Middle East. There's been talks, as you know, also about normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There is talk also about working together, working out an alliance, a wider alliance between the U.S. and its allies in the region. It doesn't necessarily have to be a military strike against Iranian targets. It can also be a military alliance, a strong deterrent vis-a-vis the Iranians with the U.S.'s allies in the Middle East, including, of course, Israel and the Sunni states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, etc. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an immediate strike. It can be also, there are other options, but I think that very clearly today what is high on the agenda of the Biden administration is a plan B, much more than a second deal, which I think nobody really believes in anymore.
Right. But just briefly, how likely in this environment an Iranian-backed terror attack, for example, against Israelis or Jewish communities abroad?
Look, first of all, there have been in the past Iranian terrorist attacks against Jewish sites abroad, including, of course, we remember in Argentina in 1992 and 1994. It's not new. The Iranians, via Hezbollah, has a presence in Latin America, in Africa, and also obviously in throughout the Middle East, including in Turkey. So the Iranian will definitely try to avenge those mysterious deaths. But again, Israel, of course, is aware of this. It's not for lack of trying that the Iranians haven't yet been able to revenge. But again, those Iranian terrorist attacks against Israeli and Western targets are not new.
Certainly not. Emmanuel Navon, stay with us. We're going to continue look at this overall subject from a different angle, because Iran's aggression towards Israel is often conveyed via its regional proxies, most notably by Lebanon's Hezbollah, which today threatened Israel's offshore natural gas platforms. Now, the Shiite militia's stance is complicating Lebanon's efforts to resolve its maritime border dispute with Israel. It's a process that needs completing before the economically strapped nation can start mining its own offshore natural gas deposits. Our defense correspondent Jonathan Regev has that story.
A gas rig making its way to its designated field. It's a normal sight anywhere else in the world, but in the Middle East, apparently, nothing is normal. For more than a decade, since the discovery of gas in the eastern Mediterranean, Israel and Lebanon have been engaged in a conflict regarding the exact location of the maritime border between them.
We aim to find commercial discoveries in Lebanon's waters and protect the rights of Lebanon and its natural resources all along its natural water borders.
In recent negotiations brokered by the United States, the disputed area ended in point number 23, meaning there were 860 square kilometers in question. But ahead of a new round of expected talks, Lebanon argued the disputed area goes all the way to point 29, practically tripling its size. The new gas rig has now arrived at its destination on the Karish field in northern Israel. A large part of it is beyond point 29, and as far as the Lebanese are concerned, this is a breach of their territory and their resources.
We announced, as Hezbollah, when the Lebanese state says there are Israelis assaulting our waters and our oil, then we are ready in terms of pressure, deterrence, and use of means, including force.
There have been no comments on the issue from Israel or the United States, though sources in Washington say the administration is furious due to the position presented by Lebanon. Israel, meanwhile, is pushing forward with its original plan. Does this mean an armed conflict may erupt on this issue? Not necessarily. Lebanon is in a dire economic situation and is eager for this issue to be resolved soon. A war with Israel would take it years and years backwards. However, most of the conflicts in the region recently started with no side had an interest in them. And this is exactly what may happen here.
And Emmanuel, as Jonathan Regev points out there, certainly Lebanon needs this gas. It needs it to be developed. It's not in the interest of the country to start a conflict or aggravate this conflict with Israel, even to the point of military conflict over natural gas. But Hezbollah has its own agenda, and that agenda is not set in Beirut, it's set in Tehran.
Exactly, and that's the problem with Lebanon. We're basically dealing with a failed state. A state that has been taken over mostly by Hezbollah. Even though Hezbollah basically lost the recent election, it still runs the show. It still controls most of the country. It hasn't been at all, put in its place by the president, a Christian president who's actually been capitulating to Hezbollah for many years. It is a country where the whole economy has collapsed, a country which cannot pay the salaries of its civil servants, of the army, and therefore the idea of a war with Lebanon, I think, is not realistic even for Hezbollah, because they would be completely wiped out. Your report said it would bring them many years backward, but it's hard to see how they could go more backward than they are today. Since the explosion at the Beirut harbor a couple of years ago, nothing has been rebuilt. It's still in the same state. So the problem here is that Israel doesn't really even have a government to deal with in Lebanon, because this government is really a shadow cabinet of itself. The show is really run by Hezbollah, which makes it really hard to negotiate. But again, of course, Lebanon would benefit from more natural gas, but it's such a dysfunctional country that it needs much more than natural gas to rebuild itself. It really needs a lot of work. It needs a functioning government. It needs a functioning polity, which it doesn't have. And a few thousand cubic meters of extra natural gas is not what is going to make the difference to this country, which used to be called the Switzerland of the Middle East and looks more today like the Somalia of the Middle East.
Well, I take your point and of course, to develop that natural gas will take years, but it would be certainly a sign of confidence in the international community to encourage further investment in Lebanon if they were to resolve that issue with Israel and able actually come to an agreement on agreements developing the gas. But the question is whether it's not in Lebanon's interest for an outright war, but if certain circumstances present themselves, not between Israel and Lebanon, between Israel and Iran, might not Hezbollah use this as an excuse to launch some kind of offensive action to try to draw Israel in, again, at the behest or the benefit of Iran, not Lebanon?
Well, the fate of Lebanon today is mostly in the hands of Hezbollah and therefore of Tehran. Obviously, decisions made in Beirut or south of Beirut are made in Tehran, and therefore any potential escalation between Israel and Hezbollah would be decided obviously by Tehran, and that is the bottom line. Therefore, those negotiations are really a smokescreen, because at the end of the day, if Iran decides to escalate with Israel, that would be a decision made there and not here in Beirut or south of Beirut.
All right, and of course, as we've seen, Tehran again moves to its own agenda. I just want to point out that, of course, in Israel, as we see the situation, the energy situation in Europe being aggravated by the war in Ukraine, more and more reason why that East Mediterranean gas, of which the Lebanese waters are part of, should be moved to Europe. But of course, logic doesn't always prevail in this part of the region, including in its waters. And Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for that.
Thank you.